Alright, let's look at 18th century menswear. A shirt, drawers were sort of 18th century underpants, hose, but just lower hose, right? Which were held up with garters. So basically we are in sock territory now. Shoes. When we look at shoes in a second, you'll be quite surprised that although some men's shoes were outrageous, most men in the 18th century actually wore quite sensible shoes, black or brown leather buckle shoes. And then this, a jabot or a cravat. Jabot, you can say jabot. I think we met this before, right, in the 1600s. Then breeches, a long waistcoat, a coat, a jacket really, but they called it a coat, a wig, and a tricorn hat. Take a look at this guy, because what he is wearing basically didn't change throughout the 1700s. Take a look, the 1720s, it's all there. The 1730s, look, yes, the jacket now flares out quite a bit at the bottom, but the elements are still there. The hose, the breeches, the shirt, the jabot, etc. The 1740s, same setup. The 1750s, but you'll notice the width shape has changed, but the rest of it is the same, essentially. The 1760s, the 1770s, and the 1780s. You'll see in the 1790s things do slightly change. Why? Because fashion is not an island, it's a response. And boy, there was something big to respond to. So breeches, waistcoat, jacket, jabot, and tricorn hat, which we'll look at in a minute again, was the absolute staple attire for 18th century men across the social economic spectrum, including the military. So whenever we talk about an army in the 18th century, they are wearing these items. So this look was applied to the working class, the middle class, and the very haughty-taughty upper class. But they are all wearing the same garments. There's just a different degree of embellishment. But let me tell you, when menswear got fancy, it got really fancy. Check out these suits. Look at the embroidery. Actually, there was more embroidery on men's clothing in the 18th century than on women's. Whoa, look at that! This is what Prince Charming would wear, isn't it? But look at the Rococo colours as well, that dusty pale pink with all of that incredible gold embroidery. And look at this. First of all, look at the colour. It's shocking purple. But then look at the little what is that? Is that a wheat sheath there? Absolutely gorgeous. And look at those, what are they called? You blow on them. Oh gosh, dandelions. Are they called dandelions? I'm a little bit tired, I can't remember. They're called dandelions. You know that you blow on? Look, they're actually worked there in embroidery. Incredible stuff. But here's the thing. Male fashion would never ever again be so decorative. This was the last time that embellishment, embroidery, colour, etc., lace, would be used on everyday male clothing. So enjoy it while it lasts. Alright, the main event. Let's look at female attire, and you will see that there really was an ever-changing silhouette. Whoa! In the 18th century. Take a look at all of those skirts. But you'll notice that although the skirt shape changes quite dramatically, the bodice actually remains more or less the same throughout the century, with 3/4 length sleeves and a squared neckline. That really was the staple look. Throughout the 18th century, there were key dresses, the dress that everybody wore, and all of these dresses had names. They appeared at different points in the 18th century, but some stuck around for several decades. The first dress we're going to look at comes from the beginning of the century, and it is called the robe volante, which actually means sort of flying dress. Here's the front, here's the side, and here's the back, and you can see where it gets the volante from, the flying bit, because of that panel of fabric that drapes down the back and down the front. Take a look at her waist, though. You can see that beneath this fabric, her bodice is still fitted to the waist. Do you like it? I think it's extraordinary. Here is another version. And this, it's a little bit different. You'll notice that it is not bodiced around the torso. It actually hangs loose all the way around, and this is called a robe battante. And I wonder if you can guess why it doesn't have a fitted bodice. That's right, the robe battante followed the idea of the robe volante, except that the bodice was looser. Why? Because the battante was a maternity dress. This is why it stayed popular throughout the century, and why it is also known as a robe à l'innocence, a robe of innocence, a dress of innocence. Although if you're wandering around in a robe battante, I think everybody knows you haven't been all that innocent, have you? Another gown that is such an instant signifier of the 18th century is the robe à la française. And this is what it looked like from the front. But this is what it looked like in the back, which is why it's also known as a sac or a sack back. It has this long panel of fabric coming from the shoulders at the back all the way down to the floor in a little train. Sometimes, as I'm sure you can imagine, those trains got very long. But the front, you can see, it isn't like the robe volante. It's fitted, you can see it, with a stomacher there, but it's the back where all the action is really happening in terms of tailoring. Here is another version with a much slimmer panel in the back. These panels had, as you can see, pleats in them so that they would fall very elegantly. And here is another one. This one with the pannier, which we'll look at in a second, which is extremely bizarre, as I think you can probably tell already. What a strange way to want to look. But regardless of decade, a dress with a panel of fabric at the back is known as a robe à la française. And it still is, by the way. But the robe à la française is sometimes known as the Votto dress. You remember him, right? One of the Rococo painters that we looked at. Well, why is it known as the Votto dress? Because so many of the people in his paintings are wearing one. And check this out. This is how people got that fullness at the hip. Basically, this is a bum roll, isn't it? But in the 18th century, it is known as a romp. And take a look at this. I found this quite fabulous jacket on the internet when I was picture sourcing. Here is the front. You can see it has a little pannier effect. Panniers, by the way, as you will learn, was the structure, the undergarment that gave women in the 18th century these very wide hips. But it had a very Rococo palette and look and embroidery too. But check out the back. Sack back. All right, another variation was the robe à l'anglaise, the English dress, robe à l'anglaise. From the front, it looks exactly like the robe à la française, right? But there's no panel in the back. And here is another version. And please note also the split skirt in the front. We saw that before in the Elizabethan era. We saw it before in the Tudor era. Here it is again, very, very popular in the 18th century. And even these pannier dresses at their fullest could be robe à l'anglaise or robe à la française. And just to remind you, again, regardless of decade, a dress without a back panel of fabric is a robe l'anglaise. It doesn't matter what structure the bottom part of the dress takes. And I just said this, didn't I? Please note the split gown with visible underskirt petticoat, as this would be more or less ubiquitous throughout the 18th century. Alright, the moment I'm sure that some of you have been waiting for, the pannier. Take a look at this dress. This is called the Fanshawe dress because it belonged to Lady Anne Fanshawe, who was very happy to walk around with the widest hips in the world, and we'll find out why in a second. This is what it looked like from the front, and this is what it looks like from the side, a completely different silhouette. That looks like it could belong to a woman with a normal human-shaped body. However, this does not look normal, and it does not look human-shaped. You think that's wide? Check this out! My goodness. You could actually serve drinks and snacks, couldn't you, on either side of her skirt, on her hips. Extraordinary. Take a look at that. Why would women want to look this way? Well, we're going to find out why in a second. I honestly think this was the most bizarre moment in all of fashion history. I really do. I really, truly do. I don't think anything we've looked at thus far has been quite so odd. Even the hoop skirts that we'll look at next week weren't as weird as this. Indeed, the shape of the pannier, you'll find out what a pannier actually is in a second. It's the structure that gives the dresses these forms. Yes, it would change shape occasionally. Take a look at that. It's slightly more familiar to our eye because from the front it looks like a hoop skirt from the 19th century, although it isn't, because of course it's very slim. It's very slim on the side. It is so bizarre, and of course we have to ask ourselves, why? Why did women want to look this way? For the love of God, why? Well, first of all, let us quash the old childbearing hips myth. I don't know if you've ever come across this, I certainly have, that fashion historians who aren't really worth their salt, whenever they are confused by something, they just say, oh, it's to show they had childbearing hips. Well, if that was true, why did old ladies wear panniers? Why did 7-year-old girls wear panniers? Panniers had nothing to do with the suggestion that women had childbearing hips. It's ridiculous. This is what it was all about. Remember, always remember, the 18th century was defined by man's supposed triumph over nature and his embrace of artifice. Everything that was man-made or altered by man or approved by man was to be revered. Remember that even the natural landscape had been drastically altered by man to form something artificial, an artificial man-made environment, like those wonderful landscapes by Capability Brown, for example, or those manicured gardens and mazes that were so prevalent in this era. Man's triumph over nature. And it was an obsession. And this obsession with changing nature, this idea of improving it constantly to produce something extremely artificial and man-made, extended to everything, including the natural silhouette. I said a second ago, this doesn't look like it belongs to a human being. This was really what the objective was. The human form was far too natural. Man had to come in and have a triumph over it. The natural human shape had to be sort of massaged into something artificial. We see it with hair, we see it with makeup, and we certainly see it with this bizarre silhouette. Fashion is not an island. It's a response. Well said, Halle. Alright, so now that we know the why, let's look at the how. How are these garments constructed? Well, with these, you've heard me say the word a million times now, panniers. Panniers. From pannier, the French word for basket. So they were sort of constructed like a basket. They were made out of either reeds or very thin pieces of wood, light wood, like balsa wood. As you can see, they are sort of concertina in design. They have a concertina effect. So when you sat down, the pannier would fold beneath you. The reeds or the wood were covered in linen, and you can see on the pannier on your left, the entire thing is covered with fabric. And then along with her pannier, a woman would wear her corset, and over her corset would go her dress, and this is how it all worked. You know, I'm always saying fashion is not an island, it's a response. You may have heard me say that once or twice in this course. And this means that stuff changes fashion. Fashion does not change stuff. Usually. Yet in the 18th century, buildings in France had wider doors to accommodate the pannier so that women could enter a room front on with a modicum of dignity instead of shuffling into a room, walking in on their side. New buildings were made to have very wide doors, because who knew how long the pannier craze would last? But the very rich, of course, if they were living in a building that pre-existed the pannier trend, they simply had their doorways widened. So when you visit Paris, some of you already have, I'm sure, and you visit a chateau from the 18th century, you'll notice that it has very wide doorways, and now you'll know why. Here are some contemporary fashion images that definitely draw from the pannier without actually using an uncomfortable pannier. And take a look. Totally pannier inspired, but also in Rococo colors with a lot of lace. Oh gosh, fashion really can't get away from the 18th century, can it? And look at this absolutely beautiful dress. Completely structured with those pannier hips. And in that teal color that we've seen so often in Rococo art and architecture, and in the case of this dress, it takes so little to turn it into an 18th century gown. Let's look at another dress from a little bit later in the century, the robe à la Polonaise. Polonaise means Polish. So presumably this was a dress that was very popular in that part of Europe, in the royal courts there. And this is what it looks like. Has a very different bottom half to the silhouette, but look, please note, the bodice is really identical throughout the century. And this is what it looked like from the back. The top layer of fabric was sort of hooched up to make these three sort of folded, puffy sacks, two at the side and one at the back. Here is another example of a robe à la Polonaise, again with that split skirt. And this is what it looked like at the side. Please note the ankles. The robe à la Polonaise was also distinct for allowing women to show their ankles, which was terribly shocking and naughty and sexy. Ooh, ankles, that was hot. The next of our popular 18th century gowns was the robe à la Creole. Robe à la Creole. And by the way, don't you love the way I'm saying all of this with quite a good French accent? Parce que oui, je peux parler en français. I lived in Paris for a while, as you know, and I was married to a Frenchman, Pierre Allais. And while I was there, I picked up quite a bit of French, believe it or not. The robe à la Creole, what does that mean? It means the Creole dress. Why? Because fashion is not an island, it's a response. I accidentally spoke French then. I almost said réponse. Fashion, ce n'est pas une île, c'est une réponse. Fashion is not an island, it's a response. What was the Creole dress responding to? Well, remember? At the beginning of the lecture, I told you that the 18th century was a time of tremendous colonization, territories, all of this kind of stuff. And those of you who have been to places like Martinique will know that France claimed a lot of territory in the Caribbean and in a little state called Louisiana, who they named after their king, Louis. And then realized that they didn't really want it and sold it to the newly formed United States for a song, the Louisiana Purchase. The robe à la Creole was like this. This is what French aristocrats who were living in the Caribbean or in Louisiana were wearing, or presumed to be wearing, by the ladies of France. You can see it there. It was a simple white gown, but with quite a lot of ruching, quite a lot of pleats, a sash around the waist, and then this sort of ruffled bodice, this ruffled neckline. There it is, and look, who's that? That's Marie-Antoinette and her robe à la Creole. And this is a very pretty reconstruction of a robe à la Creole. I think it's really cute, don't you? And here is an item I want you to be aware of. Both men and women wore it. It was tailored slightly differently for each, and it's called a redingote. And basically, it's either single, but usually double-breasted coat, like this, with a very, very wide collar. Here is a museum piece, a redingote. Here is a redingote in a painting, and please check out that little boy's bangs. Wow. And here is a modern interpretation of a redingote. See? And the last of the dresses we're going to look at is the robe en chemise, which is really shirt dress. Chemise, as you know now, is shirt. Robe en chemise. It's very different, isn't it? Compare that to the pannier, or the robe à la française with all of the embroidery and the this and the that. Look at this dress. Here it is again. Tight long sleeves, a square neckline, and just a simple sash. No embroidery, no pannier, no lace, no shit, nothing. You could not get a simpler dress. Right. The robe en chemise came about in the 1780s and 90s. And this new silhouette, what you're seeing here, would absolutely define fashion in the first 2 decades of the 1800s. So you're going to be seeing something very similar to this when we go into the 19th century. Why? Why did the silhouette, and not just the silhouette, but everything, palette, trim, ornamentation, of which there is none, why did it change so drastically and so suddenly? Because fashion is not an island, it's a response. There's your clue. What happened? What happened in 1789 in France that would continue into the first years of the 1790s, that would change not only France but fashion and the world? You'll find out pretty soon, if you haven't guessed already. Well, we're going to look at jackets and hats and trim and stuff like that, but before we leave the French dresses, and when I say French dresses, they all originated in France, but all fashionable ladies throughout the West wore these dresses. Let's play a game. Which of the following 18th century dress styles were the inspiration for these contemporary looks? What about this one? Any thoughts? Any ideas? I would say this one was very reminiscent of the robe volante, with that fabric down the front, the panel down the front and the panel down the back, the robe volante. Okay, moving on. What about this one? Easy. This is an easy one, right? The pannier. What about this one? I would say this is the robe en chemise idea, isn't it? Of course, this has short sleeves, but very simple, with that quite high waist with a sash around it. What about this one? With this panel of fabric down the back? Well, of course, the sack back. The robe à la française, the sack back dress. And what about this? Well, that's the Creole dress, isn't it? The robe à la Creole. It's the same dress, essentially. So I hope that this drop here in the PowerPoint makes you see that really everything that happens today has happened before. And that's why you need to know your fashion history, right? Another item I want you to be aware of is the caracal. Sometimes it's spelt like that, sometimes it's spelt like that, and this is what it looked like. It was a separate jacket or bodice with a peplum. Isn't that gorgeous? I'd love to wear that just with a tank top and jeans, wouldn't you? It would be so tremendous. Here is another example. And this is what it looked like when teamed with a skirt. But often it would actually be made of the same fabric as the skirt to give it this sort of suit effect. I love it. What about you? And here are some contemporary interpretations of the caracal. And again there, with the square neckline, very 18th century. Although, in the 18th century it would not have been black. Women did not wear black at all unless they were in mourning. And this, I think, is so elegant and gorgeous, but still completely following the form of the caracal, except that this has, as you can see, a V-neck, whereas to be truly 18th century it would have to have a square neck. Well, you may have noticed that in an awful lot of these female outfits, these dresses and these paintings, women are wearing a piece of fabric around their shoulders. And this has a name. It is called a fichu. And here it is. Sometimes it was plain, sometimes it was lace, sometimes it was sheer, sometimes it wasn't. Here we see it in paintings. And it could also be wrapped entirely around the body and tied at the back, like this. I just wanted you to be aware of what it was so that you noticed it and to know that it has a name, fichu. Alright, what are we seeing here that we haven't truly seen before in this course on clothing? Have you figured it out? Stripes! That's right, stripes. Stripes were an absolute fad, a fixation, an obsession of the 18th century. People loved stripes. Stripes were a genuine craze, and they were known as Peking stripes, tying in with the 18th century interest in something known as Orientalism and chinoiserie, which will really peak in the early 19th century, so we'll look at it then. But as you guessed, it has everything to do with colonization and territories and imperialism and all of that. Peking, in case you don't know, I'm sure you do, is the former name of Beijing. Peking stripes, they were a fad. Everybody loved them. They were a craze. Look, whoever wore this outfit loved them so much she has them on her hatband and on her dress. And look at these two pretty girls who are beautifully and very authentically recreated to robe à la Polonaise dresses in. So sticking with embroidery, let's look at gold. Gold thread, which was actually made of spun gold. Oh my goodness. It was extremely popular in the 18th century, as was silver thread, but gold thread, come on. You wear a dress like this, what are you saying to the world? You are saying you are rich, you are powerful, you are important, you can afford this. Look at this suit. Look at all of the gold thread. Now, gold thread was not cheap. Neither were the satins and brocades and taffetas and all of the textiles that make up Rococo clothing. You may have noticed I don't really talk about textiles too much in this course because you have either taken or will be taking textiles as a requirement, so I don't want to steal the thunder from your textiles teachers. But as I'm sure you can imagine, these were extremely expensive textiles, and then you add gold to them, you are making an enormous statement. And here's that pink suit again. So Rococo, but look at all of that gold. When you see details like this, it's really kind of mind-blowing. It would take months and months of care and skill and pride, often working by candlelight, for people to complete the beautiful embroidery on these pieces. So if you aren't getting a little bit disgusted with the European aristocracy of the 1700s yet, you will be. Wait until you hear this. There was a hobby, a little craze, amongst the aristocracy of the 18th century called drizzling. Drizzling. After wearing one of these gold embroidered garments only a few times, once they'd made sure everybody had seen them in it, 18th century aristos would drizzle it. Basically, they would unpick all of the gold embroidery and pull out the gold threads because they found it relaxing. It was relaxing to destroy one of these beautiful garments. The idea was that they would, sell the gold thread back to a merchant, but, they were rich enough they probably didn't bother because after it had been pulled apart, it wasn't worth remotely as much. Here is a very pretty little drizzling kit. Men and women liked to drizzle. They would sit around drinking port and drizzling and destroying these beautiful dresses and suits. Ah! Just to remind you, this is a drizzling kit, so these people had no appreciation whatsoever of the workmanship and hours and artistry that went into this beautiful embroidery. And when an institution of any sort is so removed from the workers who service it, something will eventually happen. And something eventually would. Ready to be scared? Good, because we're going to look at 18th century hair and makeup. Let me tell you, there is some creepy weird shit coming up. Look at this guy here. No, he is not wearing some weird serial killer mask like Hannibal Lecter or Leatherface. No, what he is holding up to his face is one of these. It's a powder cone. And fashionable people would hold one of these creepy-looking cones up to their faces when their hair was being powdered so that the powder wouldn't get into their eyes or ruin the rest of their makeup. This was the golden age of powdering. Powdering. Powder was either applied with sort of a flicky brush, like this servant is doing here, or with a mechanical pump, far more efficient. What was it made of? Well, at the lower end of the spectrum, it was made out of things like cornstarch, but the real poshies used very finely milled and scented flour. Powder would sometimes be tinted as well, tinted blue or violet or purple, just to shake things up a bit. Let's start with the boys. Wigs at the beginning of the 18th century were very similar to the full-bottomed wigs that we saw in the 17th century, at the end of the 17th century, remember, except that they were powdered white. Wigs in the 1600s were not powdered, they were in the 1700s, and they had these two large peaks at the top. They also have a name, these wigs. They're called allongé wigs. Now, here's the thing. Allongé is a French word meaning elongated, but it isn't spelt like this. This is the way it is spelt when talking about this kind of wig. I could have gone and done some in-depth research as to why allongé is spelt this way. I think it's an anglicized version, a phonetic version of allongé, an elongated wig. But then very quickly we get this. This is the wig of the 18th century, and it has a name. It is called a buckled wig or a buckled clubbed wig. But try saying buckled club wig 10 times in quick succession and you'll find it is quite a tongue twister. Wigs were not white. They were not made of white hair, as some people may believe. No, they were usually brown and then powdered white. Why? Well, fashion is not an island, it is a response. And let me tell you, it's pretty hard to find white hair. White hair belongs to old people. When people are old, their hair has, generally gone quite brittle and thinned out quite a bit. You're not going to get good quality, thick white hair, are you, from an old person? No. Wigs were brown and then, or blonde, or sort of mousy blonde, and then powdered. And this is what they looked like. I rather like them. What about you? And here is a contemporary recreation of a wig that has been tinted a sort of blondish orange colour. And this lad here, he has 18th century makeup on too. It's a rather odd look, but it's very artificial, isn't it? It's a very artificial look. Remember, artifice ruled. Some men, however, couldn't be bothered with all of this, and they just grew their natural hair out to their shoulders and then tied it in a ponytail at the back, working class men particularly, and colonial American men. And we'll find out why in a second. The ponytail on both a buckled wig and on natural hair also has a name. It was called a queue. A queue. Queue is the French for tail, and we use the word queue sometimes instead of saying line, don't we? Oh, I'm sorry I'm late for class. The queue at Starbucks was a nightmare. The hat of the entire 18th century was this. It is called a tricorn hat. Tricorn. Can you figure out why? Hello, it's got 3 corners. Tri-cornered, tricorn hat. Interestingly, though, it wasn't called a tricorn hat until about 100 years after people wore it. It got the name in the 19th century. During the 18th century, it was simply called a cocked hat. Let's turn to the ladies. Well, contrary to popular belief, 18th century women seldom wore full wigs. Instead, fashionable women would coif their natural hair and then add hair pieces and fake curls and lots of false hair to give height for high fashion events and to sport the novelty coiffures, the novelty coifs of the era. Their hair would be powdered white, but occasionally also it would be tinted with those blues or purples. And here, if you look at this picture on the left, I think this is a pretty good and very accurate reconstruction of what everyday hair was like for the fashionable of the 18th century. And I love this because you can really see what's going on here. Her natural hair is teased and pulled over fake hair to give that enormous beehive, with fake rolls probably added at the side, and flowers and feathers and this and that. But sometimes these coiffures would become incredibly high, these coifs, and spectacular, like this, kind of ridiculous. And they went along with novelty hats. Here is a contemporaneous image of all of the various hairdos and novelty hats beloved of the aristocracy and the fashionable in the 18th century. But none was as silly as this. The Belle Poule, debuted by Marie-Antoinette herself. The Belle Poule was the name of a French military ship that was being honored in this hairdo, an incredibly high powdered hairdo with a model ship incorporated at the top. No wonder satirists made fun of these hairdos and hats. This is an English cartoon, a contemporaneous one. The lady's maid or toilette headdress. Here she has her entire dressing table incorporated into her hat. And I love this one. This is a hairdo so large and elaborate that it incorporates another lady who also has a large and elaborate hairdo. Absolutely silly. Of course, this wasn't a real hairdo. That would break somebody's neck, but I think that these hairdos did get a lot of flack. People making fun of them all the time. Here is a contemporary fashion image that is obviously inspired by the very, well, I wouldn't say very natural look, because the 18th century was all about artifice, but the less silly hairdos of the 18th century. Remember I said that women would style their natural hair and then add powder. I think this is really pretty, don't you? But here is the belle poule. And here again, look at this image on the right. I think this is extraordinary, don't you? I love that. Hats were either big figuratively or big literally. Figuratively, the novelty hat that incorporated everything, bows and flowers and ostrich feathers, was extremely popular, as were those enormous chapeaux that we saw in the Gainsborough paintings. Like this. The hats had to be big because the hairdos were so big. Here is a hat that was extremely popular in the 18th century in the summer. It has a name, it's called a bergère. And bergère is shepherdess. So it was supposed to be a bit like a shepherdess's hat. And I'm sure you know that Marie-Antoinette used to dress up as a shepherdess along with her friends, because she had an entire little farm village constructed in the grounds of Versailles, so she and her friends could pretend they were poor. This is what a bergère looks like in real life. You could either wear it flipped up or pulled down like this with these two ribbons, which I think is very pretty. And here is a still from the movie The Duchess with the lovely Keira Knightley there with another lovely lady, both wearing this style of hat. I think it's extremely pretty. Prettier than this, that's for sure. Look at that. Well, these hairdos got so enormous that on a windy or rainy day you would need something to protect them. And a calèche protected your hair. That is what it looks like in a painting, but this is what it looks like in a Chanel ad, a calèche. Alright, let's look at shoes. As I'm sure you can guess, ladies' shoes of the 18th century were every bit as ornate and over the top as their dresses, with lace and embroidery and gold and this and that and brocade and heels. Take a look at this pair of shoes that have survived from the 18th century. Could you get anything more Rococo in every single way? The palette. Oh my God, they're so pretty, aren't they? Is that gold thread? I'm surprised that hasn't been drizzled away. Here's a fun fact. In the 18th century, shoes did not come in left and right. No, each was identical. And the shoe then took the form of each foot after a person wore it for a few times. But my goodness, these are pretty shoes. Many of these shoes had very interesting novelty heels like this one. And again, please note the gold thread, and note the palette, those soft corals and that weird soft sea foam. Mules were also very popular, like these ones here, again with gold embroidery. But as I mentioned earlier, men's shoes were weirdly sensible by comparison. Brown or black leather with a buckle. Although sometimes even men's shoes could get a bit extreme. Look at the heel on this shoe. This is a man's shoe. But check out these shoes. These are the Louboutin Marie-Antoinette shoes. Completely Rococo, right? But look at the detail at the front. It's Marie-Antoinette with the belle poule. Everything's making sense to you now, isn't it? Alright, makeup. What we have here is actually very similar to what makeup in the 18th century actually looked like. Let's break it down. Okay, that lead-based ceruse that we saw in the Elizabethan era was back and covered the face of both men and women, but women would often use it on their necks, shoulders, and décolletage as well. Women would also highlight the veins of their breasts in blue. Rouge was made of something called Spanish wool, which was a rough, dye-soaked textile, maybe a bit like a Brillo pad, that people would rub onto their cheeks in triangular shapes. It was a bit like a scouring pad, evidently. Ouch. Lipstick was applied to the very front of the lips in a bee sting look that would come back in the 1920s. And eyebrows were high and either drawn on with pencil or stuck on with fake eyebrows made of mouse skin. Yeah, charming, right? Mouches. Mouche is the French for fly, like, fly that flies around the garbage. Mouches, these were little patches, often used to cover scars from pox or syphilis, but then they became a little trend in their own right. Mouches were made of leather or velvet or satin or silk, and sometimes they came in a variety of novelty shapes, hearts or stars, and I even once saw a mouche in the shape of a horse and carriage. So this is really what people kind of looked like, quite different to the way that fashion editorials today depict 18th century makeup, isn't it? Well, now that we've looked at all of the individual elements that make up 18th century fashion and style, let's do an anatomy and answer some questions that might still be remaining about why people wanted to look this way. Okay, we'll start with our naked mannequin. First thing, a shift. Then a corset, stays. Then the pannier, which we've already looked at. Then the petticoat. Then the gown. And just to remind you, 18th century gowns are distinctive for their 3/4 length sleeves and square neckline. And gowns were called mantuas often. We've already met the mantua. A mantua is a dress that's made out of the same fabric, the top and the bottom. But really, because of the influence of the French court, robe was used, robe, which of course is the French for dress. Then you have the stomacher, which we've already discussed. Engagions, I said we'd meet those again. Engagions, they are the lace sleeves that were attached and detached to the sleeve of the dress. And then a choker, a collier, a choker. Sometimes they were very ruffled and fancy, but there was a real craze just to have a very simple black ribbon tied around your neck. This was considered extremely hot, and it really, the simplicity of it really highlights, doesn't it, how complicated the rest of the dress is. That minimalist touch really highlights and shows off the fanciness of everything else. Then, of course, powdered hair. And just to remind you, contrary to popular belief, 18th century women seldom wore full wigs. They powdered their natural hair and then added false hair pieces to their natural hair, along with feathers and ribbons and all manner of nonsense. And come on, let's give her a belle poule. And makeup. I've already told you that ceruse was back in action. I told you about artifice, but just to remind you, you're going to hear from people in your life who don't know any better that the reason women and men in the 18th century made their faces so white was to show that they didn't work outdoors, that they weren't farmers, they weren't labourers. Hello, I think anyone who wears a dress like this, we're going to know they're not a labourer. The white faces, the ceruse, was all about artificiality. Remember? The Age of Enlightenment was defined by man's triumph over nature, celebrated with artifice and the taming of everything from landscapes to the human form to an improved and man-created state. It had nothing to do with trying to look like you didn't work on a farm. But you know what? It also helped hide scars from smallpox and syphilis and the permanent damage caused by ceruse. Talk about a catch-22. Mouse skin eyebrows, yep, applied in a high and haughty expression, rouge applied in a very clown-like way, and lipstick on the tiny front of your mouth, that little bee-stung spot, was used by both men and women, some men. So now that you've seen the anatomy, you'll realize that it was utterly impossible for the wealthy and fashionable people of this era to actually dress themselves. You needed servants. All right. There were not enough toilets at Versailles, yet the palace was always crowded with aristocracy and hangers-on and toadies and friends and suckers-uppers. So get this. Servants were instructed to place piles of hay behind the beautiful curtains, even in the Hall of Mirrors. And then aristocrats, so beautifully dressed with their panniers and their powder, would go behind the curtains, even in the middle of a banquet where there was food, and do their business. They'd have a wee, or worse. Enough said about that. And then in the morning, servants were expected to clean up human feces. Nice. Aristocrats at Versailles ate the royal family's leftovers. They ate leftovers. Like this lovely piece of pie here. Yet often this food would be hanging around in unrefrigerated conditions and not only go off, but be infested with maggots. Oh my God! Yet the royal cooks were instructed to simply remove the maggots and pour sauce over everything to hide the taste and the smell of rotten, maggot-ridden food. Ooh! Ah, that's much prettier, isn't it? A pretty lady, a lovely aristocrat. Well, powdered wigs and hairpieces were styled using beeswax or lard. And as a consequence, they absolutely stank. So people doused their hair and bodies with perfume to cover up the smell. But worse, they were infected with lice and fleas. So that even the most fashionable of aristos would carry pretty little scratching sticks around with them to scratch the flea bites on their head. Like this one here, I love it. It has a little ivory hand at the end. Oh, it gets worse. It gets so much worse. These pretty powdered faces might look good in paintings, but in real life, as you know, the pasty ceruse and rouge would look completely grotesque. Something like this, actually. Yeah. But it often masked a bigger issue. Smallpox was rampant in the 18th century, and people used thick coats of ceruse to cover the permanent scarring of smallpox, which looks like this. And this was permanent. The nobility of Europe consumed vast amounts of sugar. Sugar, of course, that you know was farmed in the West Indies by enslaved West Africans. And in a time of poor to non-existent dentistry and dental hygiene, many of these pretty people had rotting teeth, missing teeth, diseased gums, and perpetually foul breath. So, shall we get her to smile? Smile! Yeah. Many people wore false teeth. Here is a pair of surviving false teeth from the 18th century. Guess what they were made of? Real teeth. People would have their own teeth removed, poor people, and sell them to denture makers who would make dentures to then sell to the aristocracy, who didn't seem to mind at all having other people's teeth in their mouth. More expensive, ivory teeth could be used. I'd go for ivory, quite honestly. No, I wouldn't. I hate the ivory trade. We all hate the ivory trade. But the idea of having another person's teeth in my mouth is quite grotesque. So people would sell their own teeth so that the rich could have dentures, or they would pull them from the mouths of dead people. This is quite a famous illustration by Spanish artist Goya. This is a man after being executed, a hanging man, and this is a poor woman pulling his teeth out to sell. But look, she can't even look at him. It's just so gross. It's even grossing her out. So, yeah. They would pull out the teeth from dead people and sell them to a denture maker. Could it get any worse? Yes, you know it's going to get worse. Syphilis. Syphilis, which we got as part of the Columbian Exchange. Syphilis comes from the New World. But, you know, fair's fair. In fact, we got the better end of the deal, because although the New World gave us syphilis, or the West syphilis, we gave the indigenous people of the Americas every other disease imaginable, from flu to smallpox, and we also destroyed them with guns and stuff like that. So really, fair's fair. Syphilis. Syphilis is a terrible disease, which is sexually transmitted. And now we've seen, haven't we, all of that naughtiness and the sexiness and the love affairs. Well, a lot of people got syphilis. It was common in the upper classes, and depending on the severity, it could have terrible outward physical consequences, the least of which were the huge pus-filled boils that covered the body. So let's give her a few of those. There we go. Yet the syphilis bacteria also ate away at the face, starting with the eyes. So it was not that uncommon to see people in the 18th century sporting glass eyes, which, given the technology available, were not all that convincing. So shall we give her a false eye? Yes, there we go. Syphilis slowly ate away at the face, and there was a market in the 18th century for false noses that syphilis sufferers could wear, because syphilis would actually eat your nose away. And this is a picture from a TV drama of somebody with syphilis applying his fake nose. Fake noses were often attached to glasses, kind of like the joke glass and noses we have today. So let's give her a pair of those as well. And look at our 18th century beautiful aristocratic lady now, not looking so hot. This is a contemporaneous image, 6 stages of mending a face. You know, you put your wig on. Syphilis also made you lose your hair. Put your false eye in. Not sure what's happening in image 3 there. Put your makeup on. Put your false teeth in. So this was a reality for many people. But just to remind us of the image that the 18th century had of itself, and it's really quite different. Now listen, of course, there were many perfectly normal and attractive aristocrats in the 18th century too, like these people here. Just don't be too fooled by Hollywood gloss. And don't let the 18th century's ever-flattering self-image fool you either. Some of the realities were pretty disturbing. The Macaronis. Who were the Macaronis? Look at that little chap over there, a macaroni. The Macaronis were English. This is very important. They were the young English sons of the English aristocracy. And when they were in the late teens or early 20s, they would complete their education by doing something called the Grand Tour, What was the Grand Tour? Well, the Grand Tour was this. A bunch of these aristocratic sons would get together and they would do a tour of Greece and Rome and the great cities of Europe, so that they could learn about ancient Greek architecture, which you already know, the Greek orders, etc. They could look at the artwork in all of the salons, and of course they would look at all of the ancient ruins of Rome, which you know all about now, the Colosseum and the Forum, etc. It was supposed to round off their liberal arts education. Well, some of these young guys preferred to go shopping, especially in Italy, because in Italy they had very outrageous clothes. And these guys would come back to England with all of this fancy schmancy clothing that they had bought in Paris and in Italy. And they also brought back a food that was only available in Italy until they brought it back, pasta. So they would have these pasta parties where they would show off their clothes. Now listen, the Macaronis were the most outrageously dressed young men around. Here is a contemporaneous etching of a Macaroni. Look at him, even by 18th century standards. He's outrageous. Look, everybody's staring at him, and I love that little kid there behind him, laughing his head off at a macaroni. And then look at the little toddler. She's a bit scared. She's bemused. She's pulling at her mother's apron. What the hell is that? A macaroni. Now, if you look at the guy in this etching, and you look at the little macaroni over on the right, I think we can probably ascertain they weren't perhaps the most masculine of guys, but they were the most outrageous dressers. They had the highest wigs imaginable. At a time when the high wig was no longer in, the Macaronis brought it back. And here is a lampoon, a cartoon, a satirical drawing of a macaroni with his servant putting his hat on with a fishing pole. Of course, he didn't really have to do that, but they were making fun of just how outrageous these guys were. This is some macaroni clothing that exists today. It's very smart, isn't it? But look, it has a corsage on it. And let's give him a trendy little hat as well. So these were really the most outrageous high fashion guys by anybody's standards. And of course they wore the most makeup. So in the 18th century, the word macaroni, because these boys were called the Macaronis, the word macaroni became an 18th century colloquialism for ultra fashionable, to the point of ridiculousness. Uber hip. People would say, oh, you know, should I wear this? And they say, oh yes, it's very macaroni. Or, you know, you're looking very macaroni today. It was an adjective meaning incredibly overdone. All right, time to explain that mysterious lyric in the song Yankee Doodle Dandy. Well, Yankee Doodle Dandy, ironically, was originally a British song making fun of Americans during the Revolutionary War. The British considered their colonial cousins to be a bit gauche and unfashionable. So now does that mysterious line in the song Yankee Doodle Dandy make sense? Stuck a feather in his hat and called it macaroni. Basically, the line means Americans are such rednecks that if they put a feather in their hat, they think they're embracing high fashion. So, fashion is not an island, it's a response. But in this case, one of our most beloved songs is a response to fashion. French Revolution. This was really something. You see that little rosette up there? This is the emblem that everybody who was for revolution, peasants, doctors, lawyers, bakers, butchers, would wear, and it has a name. It is called the cocarde tricolore. the tricolored cocarde, the three-colored rosettes, and these three colors, of course, would eventually go forth to make up what? The French flag. But these cocardes tricolores were worn everywhere, and this is a pair of mules that survive from the era of the French Revolution, the late 1780s going into the 1790s, with the cocarde on the front. The guy behind the French Revolution was this guy, wearing stripes, of course. He was called Robespierre, and he was the leader of the revolutionaries. He wouldn't stay their leader, as you will see, but wow, this was something. And just note, Les Mis is not set during the French Revolution. I have had so many students over the years, whenever I mention the French Revolution, they say, oh, I love the French Revolution, I love Les Miserables. Les Miserables is not set during the French Revolution. Les Mis begins in about 1815, and the French Revolution kicked off in 1789, so Les Miserables happens later. And it ends with events surrounding the Paris Uprising, which was another event. The French got a king back for a while, and they didn't take to it, and that happened in 1832. So Les Mis and the French Revolution, two separate time periods. So the French revolutionaries had a name, and the name ties in with fashion. Again, we're seeing clothing being used as a political signifier, aren't we? We saw it in the English Civil War, remember? Oh, we've seen it many times, and we're seeing it here with les sans-culottes, which literally translates as without breeches. Look at these three sans-culottes here. They're not wearing breeches. They're wearing trousers. And sometimes those long pants, which the upper class thought were terribly uncouth, were striped. And here is a revolutionary woman, and her skirt is striped with these red and yellow stripes. And it's so interesting that we associate, don't we, the stripes with high fashion, that second estate fashion. It's so interesting that the stripe was appropriated by the sans-culottes as part of their uniform, as it were. But really it is this that we associate with the style of the French revolutionaries, this red sort of pointy hat. And it has a name. It's called either the bonnet rouge or the Phrygian cap. The Phrygian cap. But there is also a jacket associated with a sans-culotte. It is called a carmagnole. A carmagnole. A carmagnole. Not the easiest word to say. And there it is. So all of these things, the yellowish, kind of like a creamy yellowish and red stripe, the bonnet rouge and the carmagnole, all of these things make up the sort of costume, as it were, of the sans-culottes. They were recognizable to each other. And look at both the hat and the jacket. They have that tricolore rosette. And here is some contemporary fashion inspired by the sans-culotte. Is there nothing that contemporary fashion doesn't latch onto? No, I think you've learned that now. We're in 1789. I think you have learned that fashion goes back to a variety of things, and in this case, of all things, the sans-culotte.